Hey there folks, the number one Black Crowes fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in my Rock Hall Review series. What is the Rock Hall Reviews, you may be asking? It's a yearly series I do, where I talk about one album from each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, talk about what I think of it, then I talk about do I think they're going to get in, and do I think they deserve to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And trust me, those two things are often very different, more frequently than you would expect. And today I'm talking about the Black Crowes, specifically their 1992 sophomore studio album, The Southern Harmony and Musical Companion. I'm not going to have fun making this thumbnail later, I'm really going to have to squeeze that title in. It's probably going to look bad. In an era where, at least in the United States, indie rock and grunge, especially the latter, were taking over the mainstream as far as popular rock music went, I think it's interesting to see how the Black Crowes provided even then a very much throwback sort of southern rock and soul kind of vibe that I honestly have nothing but respect for. I mean, whether or not I love the Black Crowes is a different story entirely, but I have nothing but admiration for a band that could look at the moodiness of bands like Soundgarden or the high punkish energy of bands like Nirvana that were really hitting the mainstream at the time and go, nah, I like Otis Redding. I think that kind of rules, honestly, and I have nothing but respect for it, especially considering they had multiple radio hits at the time. Really the only super mainstream band that was keeping southern rock from feeling like a regional scene again after decades had passed since its last shot in the mainstream with bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd and Little Feat. But, I digress. Their 1990 debut, Shake Your Moneymaker, was a big deal at the time. A lot of people really loved it, and it only makes sense that they would follow it up with this record, an album that pretty much follows the winning formula of a surprisingly good bar band, but at the same time feels artistically and sonically a little bit larger. So, as a whole, it's pretty much in the same vein as what you would expect from a southern rock band, and I mean, yeah, it's the Black Crowes. There's plenty of good tracks here, like Hotel Illness, and, of course, Remedy, which is easily only behind She Talks to Angels and their cover of Otis Redding's Hard to Handle as their most popular song, certainly the most iconic track they put out after their debut studio album. And I mean, yeah, as a whole, I think the best songs here are the shorter, more straightforward kind of cuts where Chris Robinson gets to belt it out while Rich Robinson lays down maybe a quick solo or two, the rhythm section does their thing, and then they get out without really spending too much time and droning on, which a couple of tracks here or there too, especially some of the more saccharine cuts, which I'll talk about in a second. But, as a whole, the band holds down a tune. That's really all I can say about the Black Crowes, because there really isn't a lot to say about them. There's not a lot of insight to give about this band because they aren't an insightful band or an intelligent band. And I don't mean that in a discriminatory way either. I just mean to say that the Black Crowes knew what they were. They were a fun rock and roll band trying to revive the mainstream rock music of old, even in 1990, because the sound was old even in 1990. But my point is, they weren't trying to be something they weren't. And even to this day, they're not trying to be something they are. And while I can admire and appreciate that, it's sort of like trying to talk about a band like AC/DC in like an intelligent or insightful way. Like, there's not a lot to give here, man. They're just a decent band, and that's really it. I think above all else, this record and the Black Crowes in general kind of just shine a light on the topic of originality and how a band can still be solid or good, even if they are very openly unoriginal in nature. I mean, in theory, every musician and every artist, period, no matter the medium, is a ripoff of their influences, either intentionally or unintentionally, but man, these guys really, wear that on their sleeves. They let their Allman Brothers flags fly here, but, that's not inherently a bad thing, and they do the sound damn well. They do it justice. They do their influences justice, but at the same time, it also kind of feels like they never really ascend to greatness, and never really have in their careers. I've listened to just about their entire discography at this point, and I really can't pinpoint a specific moment where it feels like they were on the same level of the bands that inspired them. I mean, they're a solid band, but it just never really feels like the Black Crowes got above good tribute band level of quality, and that's not inherently a bad thing, and that's probably going to come across as a bit more insulting than I'm intending it to be, but at the same time, that's how I feel. It just feels like the Black Crowes were a band that were capable of doing really strong Southern rock, but would have been a footnote if they had come out just 20 years earlier, even 10 years earlier. I just can't help but feel like they are only seen as a super unique and beloved band because they debuted in a time period where this sound basically didn't exist unless you were actively looking for it. So for them to manage to hit the mainstream, and not only hit the mainstream, but have lasting hits that still get played in media, on the radio, to this very day, especially their cover of Otis Redding's Hard to Handle, I just feel like that's the main reason why people still care about them, why they're up for nomination for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Because the thing is, there are plenty of other Southern rock bands out there that either inspired the Black Crowes or were around at the same time as the Black Crowes that either sounded like them or honestly sounded more original than them. And again, I'm not saying that this is inherently a bad thing that they aren't a super original band, because of course that's not a bad thing, but, you know, it really does make one wonder, would the Black Crowes have been that relevant to, you know, the cultural zeitgeist, even at the time, if they had just debuted a little bit earlier than they eventually did? And now, don't get me wrong, I do appreciate what they stood for at the time. I mean, I do think in the early 90s, a lot of the popular, darker music of, you know, grunge and a lot of depressive indie rock was still great, but I do kind of appreciate the fact that the Black Crowes sort of predicted that it was soon going to turn into bands like Bush and Creed by the mid to late 90s, and that would just kind of get thrown out the window and would also become awful and something that kind of destroyed that genre and movement in and of itself, while the Black Crowes just kind of kept doing their thing. And I admire that, but I don't know. The music itself, I enjoy it, but never to the point where I feel like I want to return to it outside of maybe a song or two. And even then, I just feel like I end up wanting to go back to other bands that influenced the Black Crowes rather than the Black Crowes themselves, especially on some of the slower and more melodramatic cuts here, like Bad Luck, Blue Eyes, Goodbye, which I honestly think verges on maybe the worst song I've ever heard by them, even though I know a lot of people love it. It's just so overwrought, but, you know, as a whole, it's a fine record. I enjoy it, but also at the same time, it just doesn't provide me any reason to go back to it when there were other bands that influenced them or sounded similar to them that were their peers that either jammed better, had more energy, were a little bit heavier, maybe played a little bit faster, or were just more interesting or boundary pushing in some way. That doesn't make the Black Crowes a bad band, but it does make a lot of other bands around them better bands. So yeah, I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Now, do I think that the Black Crowes deserve to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And honestly, to be blunt, my answer is no. I just don't really see why. Maybe if, again, I've said this in every review I think I've done so far for the series this year, but if there wasn't such a backlog, I would maybe not have as much of a problem with it. But at the same time, what did the Black Crowes do to really, you know, push the envelope? I mean, at this point, it feels like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame being as exclusive as it is and really kind of keeping a lot of more alternative acts out of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it feels like the idea behind the Rock Hall should be that you can't tell the history of popular music without this band or this artist. And while I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment, that's kind of what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame feels like, to me, at least right now. And then I think about it, and I think about the Black Crowes, and honestly, I don't see any way that you would really need to tell their story. Maybe if you were talking about the history of Southern rock, and even then, honestly, that's kind of a stretch. I feel like if you just talk about 20 to 30 bands that preceded the Black Crowes, you kind of covered the, you know, the width of the genre in its most important decades, you know. I wish that the Black Crowes felt as unique for the entire history of music as they did for the early 90s, in terms of the mainstream of music at the time, at least. And I don't know, as a whole, I don't see a reason why they would be inducted. I mean, a lot of the sort of Southern rock bands of the modern day that I see tend to cite the Black Crowes' influences as their influences instead of the Black Crowes as their influences. And I don't get it, other than commercial impact and a bit of a cult fan base. And even then, I get that the Black Crowes have always continuously released music. They're back together now. Their last album was extremely mediocre. But just as a whole, they aren't some sort of iconic band that everybody knows every member of. And at least when bands like Foreigner, for example, get inducted, I kind of understand it, because at least at that point, it's a stadium band with like 10 to 20 hits that get played on classic rock radio every day, or even Bad Company, who's also nominated this year. I don't necessarily think they're the most deserving inductees, but it makes sense when you consider the institution and the kind of audience and age group that they aim for. The Black Crowes just doesn't really make any sense to me. I just don't really think that they deserve it. I won't have any massive qualms if they do get in, but yeah, I don't see why they would. And honestly, I don't really see them getting in either. I feel like if there weren't so many classic rock-oriented bands on the list this year, I do think that they would probably have a chance, but I don't know, man. When, like, Bad Company's on this list, Joe Cocker's on this list, I mean, hell, even if you want to really stretch the definition of, like, classic music, bands like, or artists like, you know, Billy Idol and even Cyndi Lauper are on the list this year. I don't see it happening. I mean, not to say that all of those artists are similar to the Black Crowes, because none of them really are, but they do represent one thing together, which is that they are older music that was a part of the mainstream, didn't really have a huge influence, but had a lot of hits, and that's what kind of gets them into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And that, at the end of the day, it feels like it applies to the Black Crowes lesser than it does all of those other aforementioned artists alongside every other artist on the list this year. And even the ones that I don't really care that much about or don't think deserve it this year, like Joe Cocker or Fish, I still think that they have better cases than the Black Crowes do, because at least they were a part of major things, major movements, major eras. You know, if you want to look at Joe Cocker, the Woodstock era, and, you know, the hippie movement. If you want to look at Fish, the jam band revival movement, kind of something that they are heavily responsible for, so on and so forth. The Black Crowes feel like they're kind of responsible for nothing other than a few hits, a couple big albums, and definitely some massive tours. And I don't know, that just feels like the extent of their impact, and while that's nothing bad, I just don't think that they'll get the attention of the voter base that kind of goes for these types of bands because of other artists on this list, and I don't think they'll get the critical attention at all when you have bands like Outkast and Joy Division / New Order nominated this year as well. You know, the kind of artists that those types of voters, you know, kind of tend to go for usually. The Black Crowes certainly not being one of them. So, as a whole, I don't think they deserve it, and I doubt they'll get in as well. I'm sure they probably will at some point, because they are a pretty beloved band overall, pretty well liked, and I think that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame does want to put in a band like this that's easily digestible, commercially accessible, has a cult fan base that'll show up and care about, you know, their induction and everything, but you know, as of the moment, I severely doubt it. And with that being said, that is the end of this entry in the Rock Hall Review series. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.